started. Welcome everybody. Welcome Professor Philip Lutgendorf. It's a great pleasure to host Professor Philip Lutgendorf today for the 5th webinar in the series on Indic studies that we started at Frame University last February, that is February 2021. It is my distinct honor and pleasure to welcome Professor Lutgendorf, who was my professor at the University of Iowa, where I did my PhD from 2004 to 2008. I never took his classes, but I consider myself as one of the Eklavyas who, without directly learning from him, I read his articles, I read his books, and that gave me new insights to my childhood passion. All of us are passionate and fascinated about Indian films, Hindi films, Bollywood now called as. Professor Lutgendorf has published series of articles on this fascinating topic, which is close to our heart, became close to my mind also. Let me briefly read his bio without going endlessly about my fascination with his articles. Professor Lutgendorf is just retired from the University of Iowa, where he was for several decades. He taught Hindi language at all levels. He was also professor of modern Indian studies in the Department of Asian and Slavic languages and literatures for 33 years until his retirement in 2018, as I said. His book on the performance of the Hindi Ramayana, The Life of a Text, by University of California, 1991, won the A.K. Kumar Swamy Prize for the Association for Asian Studies. He received a Guggenheim Fellowship, an extremely prestigious fellowship in the US in 2002 in 2003 for his research on the popular Hindu so-called monkey god Hanuman, which appeared as Hanuman's Tale, The Messages of a Divine Monkey. That book was published by Oxford University Press in 2007. His interests include epic performance traditions, folklore, and popular culture and mass media. He maintains a website devoted to Hindi cinema, aka Bollywood, at the University of Iowa.uiowa.edu/Indian cinema. 4 volumes of his new 7-volume translations of the 16th century Ramcharitmanas of Tulsidas for the Murthy Classical Library of India have appeared as the Epic of Ram by Harvard University Press, 2016 and 18. His research on the cultural history of chai in South Asia began in 2010 with a Fulbright Senior Fellowship. He has served as president of the American Institute of Indian Studies from 2010 to 2018 and currently chairs its board of trustees. Welcome, Professor Lutgendorf, and whom we call as Philip Ji, our own Philip Ji. Welcome, Professor Lutgendorf.
Thank you. I'm trying to share my screen here. Is that
yes.
working?
Yes.
Okay. And you can see the
yes.
title slide. Okay. Yes. Thank you very much, Professor Jain. And I'm having my morning chai even as I do this lecture. I'm going to start out with a little bit of ancient history, which about myself, which will recapitulate some of what Professor Jain very generously said. Most of my scholarship has been on popular storytelling traditions of the subcontinent, especially Ramayana, its characters, themes, and folk performance genres. And I've been engaged for over a decade now in this 7-volume translation of the Tulsidas Ramayana, of which actually 5 volumes are out and the 6th is about to come out. And I just sent off the text for the 7th last week, so it's nearing an end. But of course, what I'm talking about today comes from a very different area of interest. In the late 1990s, I started watching a lot of Hindi films for the first time. It was partly sparked by the interest of my language students at the University of Iowa. They were interested in cinema, and I felt I should know more about it. And as I watched, and it was also partly inspired by the availability of better quality prints of films that were coming out on DVD at that time. And of course, I was astonished by the breadth and the creativity of popular cinema in India. And I started appreciating some of the masterpieces of mainstream cinema, great stars, directors, musicians. And I was shocked by its absence from the film studies curriculum in universities all over the world, in the United States, of course, but even in India. There simply wasn't serious scholarship on popular cinema. Typically in the United States in those days, in the 1990s, there would be a world cinema course in a film studies department. And India would be, if it was represented at all, India would be represented by one film, and it was almost always this film, Potter Panchali, by Satyajit Ray, a great Bengali director, and a film that won a bunch of international awards in the 1950s, but not a representative film in any sense, a film heavily influenced by Italian neorealism, an art film without songs, and a film that was not popular in India, and it wasn't even popular in West Bengal, you know. So, but that would be the token Indian film. And then the professor might mention, oh yeah, I understand they also make a lot of musicals. And, you know, Americans had a vague idea of what a musical was, but they didn't know any more than that. So around this time, I teamed up with a film studies colleague to offer a course that I think was probably the first course in any major university survey course on the history of popular Hindi cinema, one semester, a semester-long course. And it's also around this time that I started creating, also with my colleague, Professor Corey Creekmore, started creating the website that Professor Jain referred to, which eventually grew to its current size, which I think is around 110 notes on about 110 films. And I really created the website because for the benefit of other educators who might want to introduce information about popular Hindi cinema into their curriculum. And many did, and many have used it, I'm gratified to know. And it was also because at that time, there was virtually no serious critical material on the internet about Hindi cinema. There was a lot of fan stuff, but there wasn't really a kind of a serious, you know, critical study of films. So I was trying to contribute to that. If any of you take a look at the website, you'll notice that the entries stop about 7 or 8 years ago. I haven't been adding to it. And therefore, particularly for any students who are watching, probably some of the films that you know best and what maybe like best are not there. And I, you know, really want to say that I'll talk later in the talk about the great complexity of the media landscape today in India, which is one of the reasons why I haven't been writing very much on it. But I think other people definitely should. And I hope that maybe even some of the people in this audience today will take up the challenge and become film studies scholars and create good new studies of recent films. Now, my title comes from a not terribly well-known film, a 1971 film directed by Raj Kapoor. But I chose it partly because of what I'm talking about, but also because this film brings up a number of interesting points about Indian cinema. The title of the film is itself a kind of clever play on the title of an Italian film from 1963 that became quite well known internationally. So for film buffs, and the Kapoors were certainly film buffs, it was a kind of clever reference to the Italian film title. Now, some of the English language critics in India immediately labeled it as a remake of the Italian film, which is absolutely ridiculous. It has no, apart from the borrowing of the idea of the title, it has absolutely no connection with the Italian film. It's about 3 generations of men in a extended family. And since the 3 generations of men are played by 3 generations of Kapoor men from a single family, it also makes reference to their actual lives, and therefore is a kind of clever intertextual reference to other films that the Kapoors have made and acted in, which is very typical of Hindi cinema. A great deal of intertextuality, as I'll say more about later. And of course, it also plays on the fact that in Hindi and a number of other Indian languages, the word for yesterday and tomorrow are the same, unlike in Italian or English. And therefore, you know, is a kind of an allusion to the cyclical nature of time, you might say, that is so predominant in the religious traditions of the subcontinent. You'll notice that I haven't used the word Bollywood except in my title, and I will avoid it because I personally don't like it. It originated in the 1970s as a kind of dismissive term in English language journalism in India. It was initially very much resented by people within the industry, and film scholars are still quite uncomfortable with it. It's used very inaccurately in the West to apply to all Indian films, including Satyajit Ray, who is not Bollywood, and film industries in languages other than Hindi, and even international art films like Monsoon Wedding by Meera Nair and people like that. And of course, the worst thing about it is that it suggests that somehow the real center of international cinema is located someplace else. And the Bombay, Mumbai film industry is a kind of secondhand derivative phenomenon. So for that reason, I don't like it. But on the other hand, it's become a kind of international name brand recognition. And so now even people within the industry generally are forced to use it. And we can't really avoid it. So here we are talking about Bollywood, despite my misgivings. Now, insofar as Western viewers know anything about Bollywood, they associate it with glamour and spectacle, romance and star power, and long films punctuated by song and dance sequences, which in American genre is a musical, although there has never existed any such genre in Indian cinema. Of course, all this is true to some extent, but it's hardly the whole story. Back in 2006, I published an article in which I argued for not just the great variety and diversity of popular Indian films, but also for their displaying distinct stylistic conventions that represent Indian cultural and aesthetic categories, including the importance of the gaze, the reciprocal gaze that we see coded in the Hindi word darshan and Persian nazar, both associated not only with love and emotion, but also with religious experience, with seeing and being seen by gods and powerful or holy persons. This leads to the importance of eyes and eye contact in classical performance traditions and popular religious art, with its great emphasis on frontal display of deities looking us directly in the eyes. But it also leads in films to conventions of seeing, conventions of love at first sight, which certainly abound in popular cinema. And the sight is usually close up and extended. And such vision also nurtures an audience desire for interaction and contact with popular stars. Now, to backtrack a little bit, the technologies of photography and film both came to India very soon after their invention in Europe, and they were enthusiastically adopted and adapted by Indians. And it's important to note that the first films were screened in Bombay only 9 months after they were first shown in France by the Lumiere brothers. Very little time lag. Among the early enthusiasts for cinema was the photographer and magician of Pune, D.G. Palke, who saw a film in about 1911, an Italian film, a silent film, of course, as all films were then, but based on the life of Christ, and he was powerfully affected by it, and wrote in his diary, as you can see, that while the film was rolling fast before my physical eyes, I was mentally visualizing the gods, that is, our gods, Krishna, Ramachandra. I was gripped by a strange spell. I bought another ticket and saw the film again. This time I felt my imagination taking shape on the screen. And then we get this very gendered language here. Could we, the sons of India, ever be able to see Indian images, but also a nationalistic implication here on the screen? Palke set out to do that. He got equipment and got trained and got some financial backing. And in 1913, he released what is generally regarded as the first feature-length film, Raja Harish Chandra, based on an episode found in both epics, actually, in Mahabharata and the Ramayana. And it was quite successful and acclaimed. And created the genre that we refer to today as mythologicals, which were especially popular in the silent era, teaching audiences the new technology through stories that were already familiar to them. And it's interesting that this trend continued with later technologies, such as television, which was partially popularized in India by the Ramayana TV serial in 1987 to 89, which I've written about. And also animated films. The first feature-length animated film was also a quote-unquote mythological, Hanuman, in 2005. So each time a new technology or a new genre of film has been introduced, mythological themes have helped people to get into it. Of course, one of the most important events for Indian cinema was the advent of sound in 1931. That created a real love for musical, sort of operatic cinema, following on a number of popular performance forms, like in Marathi Tamasha and in Hindi Nautanki and other genres. After Alam Ara, which was the first sound film, there was a great emphasis on music in films. In 1932, Inder Sabha was a 211-minute film that had 72 songs in it. It was basically an opera. But very quickly, the mythological genre gave way to other genres that began to be made with sound. The historical, the stunt film. Interestingly, one of the first superstars in Hindi cinema was a woman of Australian background, Mary Evans, who played the character Fearless Nadia in a whole series of very popular films in the 1930s. Crime dramas, and of course the sort of omnibus category of the social, which is applied to an enormous range of films. But of course, you'll notice that there's no musical, because there was no such thing. All of these films had music in them, and most had dance as well. I'm gonna go through a couple of text-dense slides here. just to show you some of what I consider some of the distinctive conventions of popular cinema in India and the Hindi cinema that we're talking about today. So the first is what I call technical and performance conventions. Lack of concern with so-called realism and the so-called invisible style, which is typical of Hollywood. One of the cardinal rules of Hollywood cinema that actors learn is don't look at the camera. But in Hindi cinema, that's violated all the time because we want to have darshan. And, the look is very important. Of course, the use of music and song and often very fine poetry by well-known poets and dance for advancing the plot or developing character. And of course, the convention, which came in very quickly in the sound era of playback singing, that is to say, the actors don't actually sing, they lip sync the songs, and famous singers who are well known outside of the cinema do the singing for them. And of course, film music has a very powerful life in popular culture, quite apart from the films that the songs are created for. Narrative conventions, a preference, as we find in traditional theater in India, for multiple moods, what you could call separate story tracks, so that often American viewers, when they watch a Hindi film for the first time, they say, well, what is it? Is it action adventure? Is it romance? Is it comedy? There seems to be everything going on, right? Well, yeah, because there is. It's a multi-course banquet of flavors, of rasas. This leads to films that are quite long and that don't have a kind of Aristotelian linear storyline, again, that Western film goers are most familiar with. In addition, there's often a star text, which is to say references to other films in which the major stars have appeared, and a kind of a persona that the stars have created through multiple films and which the audience knows about. And this too feeds into the notion of intertextuality, the fact that the films, this is a very cinephilic cinema. That is to say, it assumes audiences that are very knowledgeable about other films. And so there are often references to other films and other songs, other actors. Think of how many films have lines from film songs in their titles, like Dil Wale Dulhaniya Le Jayenge, for example, which is a line from an earlier film song. And then some thematic conventions, of course, this very strong notion of dosti, friendship, a very strong element of nationalism, but also the critique of nationalism in sometimes subtle or not so subtle ways. Very powerful bond between Ma and Beta in the films. As well as other indications of family values, generally based on the kind of North Indian patriarchal extended family, but seen often as a kind of microcosm of society or the nation. And then the strong theme of the conflict between individual desire and a kind of a larger duty to the family or the social group. In the remainder of my talk, I'm going to draw on the work of a colleague of mine, Tejaswini Ganti, a very fine anthropologist and scholar of film at New York University. And from the second edition of her guidebook to, as you can see, Bollywood, there's that word, that came out in 2013. Professor Ganti in this book presents a historical overview of Hindi cinema that she divides into 4 periods. And she's very careful to point out that this is not an absolute kind of breakdown. We're talking about tens of thousands of films over this span. And obviously they don't all fit in neatly into these eras and categories that she's created. But she finds this a useful way of looking at some of the major themes and especially some of the most popular films of each period. And I agree, and I'm going to use this in going through my kind of brief history today. So let's begin with what she calls the Nehru Congress Era, which is the immediate post-independence period. Jawaharlal Nehru was the first and longest serving prime minister. And the films of the period are characterized by a kind of optimism, a kind of enthusiasm for nation building. And one of the very iconic and popular films of the period is Raj Kapoor's Shri 420, which I've translated the title as The Gentleman Crook, 1955. It's actually one of my personal favorite films of all time. And I'm just going to show you a little clip from the very beginning of the film, what I call the establishing song, which is itself a convention in Hindi cinema, where the hero is introduced through a song, and a song that kind of gives us a glimpse of his persona as it's going to be presented in the film.
Bombay 420.
There's a lot I could say about this song, and I wish I could play the whole of it for you. But suffice it to say that it introduces this trademark Chaplin-like character that Kapoor had created, and his composite identity, which is very much like the national identity that India is kind of striving to create, with borrowing from here and there and taking, and yet with its dil remaining Hindustani at the time. By the way, this song was internationally popular in Russia, China, much of the Middle East and Africa. People were singing it all over, and Kapoor became a superstar for them as well. Despite some darker moments, the film largely projects the idealism and patriotism associated with the period, when Nehru's Congress Party won repeatedly in elections and had a quite strong mandate. You can see Panditji Nehru in the background of the scene in a poster on the wall, as Raju, the hero, is talking to Vidya, his beloved, played by Nargis. Another iconic film of the period, with a woman as the central character, is Mehboob Khan's Mother India, a massive rural epic with 12 songs, often compared to the American film Gone with the Wind. And again, starring Nargis, a woman who came out of a courtesan family background and became a tremendous star. And I would be amiss if I passed over the 1950s without mentioning another of my favorite directors, Guru Dutt, and a film that is unquestionably a masterpiece, Pyasa of 1957. If you've never seen it, I strongly recommend it. And this is a film that really is in a much darker register and has a great deal of implied critique of the failures of the new nation and the failures of the political elite in delivering on the expectations of the Indian people. So it's a very interesting kind of contrast to Kapoor's more upbeat vision. Certainly by the second period, what Ganti calls the crisis of the state, the euphoria and confidence of the early post-independence period had definitely worn off. There was growing disillusionment with government corruption, poverty, unemployment. And of course, in the middle of this, we have the emergency from Indira Gandhi's assumption of dictatorial powers between 1975 and 77. And really the beginnings of the erosion of the Congress Party mandate. It really begins to slip in popularity. And the most successful films of the period are epitomized by a series of films starring Amitabh Bachchan, often as a working class hero wronged by society and seeking revenge. And the iconic film I've picked for this is Diwar from 1975, just before the emergency begins, in which he plays Vijay, a manual laborer turned gangster who becomes rich but comes into conflict with his older brother Ravi, an upright policeman. The film had very few songs. It was not a song-driven film, but it was renowned for its crisp and dramatic dialogue that was written by Salim Khan and Javed Akhtar, very popular duo of the period among screenwriters. As in this scene in which the brothers meet after many years under a bridge where they lived on the pavement, on the footpath with their mother as children. Mere paas maa hai. One of the most famous lines in Hindi film history, epitomizing the mother-son bond and family values. But of course, does Officer Ravi really have her mother, here played by, as she often was, by Nirupama Roy at that time? We learn in time that the criminal son, Vijay, is really her favorite, just as he is ours in the audience, even if the film's moral universe requires that he come to a violent end. Now, in 1991, the Indian economy began to be transformed from a semi-socialist to a neoliberal capitalist model to allow for more private investment, including by multinational corporations. And this was reflected in what Ganti calls the liberalization and consumer tendency in films, reflected in opulent romantic films featuring upper middle class characters on sets awash with glossy consumer goods. Sometimes the hero and heroine even lived overseas as NRIs, as in the iconic DDLJ of 1995, which concerns a love affair between British resident Indians and is set half in the UK and Europe. And I'm going to play just a very brief clip from this because I know everybody knows this song, I think, kind of soft focus, misty romanticism, was much admired and much copied by other filmmakers and also parodied by other filmmakers, as in a song sequence from Dil Chahta Hai in 2001. But incidentally, the clip that I showed exemplifies the convention of playback singing. Both actors are, of course, lip syncing, and the audience knows this and accepts this. And the singing voice of Kajal, who was 20 at that time, was being supplied by Lata Mangeshkar, who was 66 years old at the time, and had been doing vocals for heroines for more than 40 years and was a superstar in her own right. The post-liberalization era introduced a new kind of hero in contrast to Amitabh Bachchan's angry young man of the 1970s. It brought in what my colleague Corey Creekmore calls the happy old boy, a perpetual adolescent party animal with no deeper concerns than romance, clothes, and product placement in a whole series of films. Finally, we come to Professor Ganti's fourth era that she calls global Bollywood. I don't think she's moved on to a fifth at this point, but maybe she has. I can't speak for her. But it really carries through from about the year 2000 to the present, as I understand it. And as she writes, it's much more difficult to characterize. And this relates to what I said in the beginning about the complexity of the media landscape in India today, especially with all the different kinds of digital platforms that are now involved. But we can point to some themes that have emerged, some trends in film production, such as the ones I've listed here: corporatization of film production, high budgets and high production values with a lot of computer-generated imagery, foreign investment and marketing. We see Netflix now having a big role in the Indian market. multiplexes and niche genres. I'll talk about that in a minute. And experimentation, including films without songs, of which there are quite a few, actually. Some of this reflects the influence of satellite TV and cable channels since the 1990s. The fact that viewers are exposed to a great variety of programming from all over the world, and they expect their own films to look more like this. It's given a more, so to say, world-class look to films. There's been a continued importance in representation of overseas diasporic communities of people from India, as in these two films. The first 2003 film set in Manhattan, the second Dostana from 2008 set in Miami Beach. There's been a revival of lavish historical films, which was a very small genre in Hindi cinema. It still is a small genre, but it's being explored more. And these are, of course, notable films by the Maharashtrian director Ashutosh Gowarkar, both very excellent films, I think. The advent of shopping mall multiplexes was a very important development because it allowed for a wider range of films. Directors no longer had to worry about filling 3,000-seat picture palaces where they had to offer something for everybody in a single film. Instead, they could experiment with films aimed at smaller, more targeted audiences and addressing sometimes pressing contemporary issues. These are sometimes referred to by critics as hatke films, sort of offbeat films. I would include in these category a film like Maqbool, an adaptation of Shakespeare's Macbeth set in the Mumbai underworld. Peeply Live, a black comedy about rural debt, farmer suicides, and 24/7 news channels. And Toilet, Ek Prem Katha, which is a love story about, well, about sanitation. There are genres that have been very little explored before in Hindi cinema, such as sci-fi, now enhanced by world-class CGI, computer-generated images, which, by the way, are often outsourced by Hollywood studios to Indian companies in Bangalore and Hyderabad, so that a lot of the Western CGI also comes from India in any case. And we even find actress-centered films, such as the excellent 2012 suspense thriller Kahani, starring Vidya Balan, and a series of kind of retrospective, highly intertextual films about the history of Hindi cinema, perhaps best exemplified by the spectacular 2007 film Om Shanti Om, which notably was the first giant hit directed by a female director, Farah Khan. And of course, the fact that Farah Khan is also Muslim brings me to the final point I want to make today, and the final note I would like to close on, with particular relevance to today's sometimes polarized political and communal media climate in India. And that is the fact that the film industry, the Hindi film industry in particular, but certainly the entire film industry in India, has always been characterized by a tremendous amount of religious and ethnic diversity and collaboration, right from the very beginning and up to the present day, of artists of all different communities working together very harmoniously to produce these wonderful films. If we go back to the early Sant films made by the Pune-based studio Prabhat in the 1930s and released in both Marathi and Hindi, such as Sant Tukaram, these films were all produced by a production team that had a Hindu and a Muslim as the directors. Vishnu Pant Govind Damle and Sheikh Fateh Lal. And I would also cite the wildly imaginative films of Manmohan Desai in the 70s and early 80s, with their multi-religious heroes, heroes who often sort of combined in their own identity or through, in this case, three brothers. By the way, this is another one of my very favorite films, and I've taught it many times. But they combine, three different religious communities. Or cutting to almost the present, 2019's Gully Boy, about a Muslim from the Dharavi slum who becomes a rap music star, and featuring real-life Christian, Muslim, and Hindu hip-hop artists. Its slogan, Apna Time Aayega, as they say, went viral, an expression of aspiration and moxie. And so to finish my remarks, I hope that the time for films that explicitly reject communalism and acknowledge the religious diversity of both the film industry and the nation of India will continue to aayega, to come for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Lutgendorf. I was chuckling all the time, but I kept my microphone on mute, so didn't want to interfere. Loved your presentation, even though many films and many things we have enjoyed so many times, but coming from you gives it a unique flavor. And I just loved your talk, as always, like your articles also. I have tons of questions, but I would like to invite audience or participants to join and ask their questions. They can type their questions in the chat window or the Q&A window, or they can, I think those are the two ways they can ask questions from probably the senior most scholar of Indian films and Hindi language in America, recently retired, but we loved his insight. I always love his insights. Any questions, audience, please? Audience are still trying to digest, I guess. But I would like to, if you permit, sir, I would like to ask you a question.
Please feel free, yes.
You refer to the darshan aspect of the film, of the Indian films, not just Hindi, but Indian films. And you refer to your article, which is my all-time favorite. Is there an Indian way of filmmaking? Would you please share with us about other senses? You refer to eyes, but also the ears and the touch. And if you could elaborate a little bit, those were great insights.
In that article, and I'm not going to go through the whole article. It's available online, so anyone who's interested can find it easily. Is there an Indian way of filmmaking? But I do talk about the different senses, and for sound, of course, I talk about the verbal dimension and the musical dimension of cinema and how important that is. And I think it's a little bit of a different take on why there is so much music and poetry and dance in films. And I tie it up to some wider cultural conventions about verbal art and verbal performance. Don't really know what else to say about that.
Katha, I think you refer to Katha Sagar and the storytelling.
That's right, I do. I refer to conventions. Well, the very strongly oral component of the epic. I mean, for example, the Tulsidas epic, which I am translating, is almost never read silently in the way that people read novels, or books today. It's almost always chanted and sung. I actually chant it while I work on it, while I translate it, because that's just such an important dimension. It's a somatic dimension. The text goes into your body and is part of your physical being. And of course, the popularity of Hindi film songs, the fact that people know them so often by heart because they've heard them on the radio or they've heard them in various nowadays, on YouTube and various digital streaming platforms, they become part of one's life as poetry does. It gets internalized. So I think you are getting some questions.
Yes. There are two great questions already. One from Professor Hannah Kim in New Jersey. I think we all know her very well. Anthropologist, senior anthropologist. So the question is, good morning, Professor Lutgendorf from New York City. How about a light question? How do you feel about the movement in the newer genres away from music and dance?
Yeah, well, again, I don't really feel, I appreciate that question, Professor Kim. I don't really feel qualified to speak about that because I haven't kept up. I haven't seen that many of the newer films or even the Hatke films, you know. I think it's good. I think it's healthy. I think the experimentation that's going on today is important. And people are moving away from these giant films that have 6 or 7 songs and are expected to fill enormous theaters. So I don't, there are certain films that are quite excellent, and I think this is going to continue, this kind of experimentation. A film like Kahani, for example, which I have actually taught several times and watched many times, and which I did include in the PowerPoint. It has songs. It has 3 songs, I think, 3 or 4 songs, but they're non-diegetic in the terminology of film scholars. That is to say, they're not part of the storyline. They're not sung by anybody within the picture, within the frame. They're heard on the soundtrack. They're background music, which is, of course, the convention in Hollywood. Hollywood films are almost all musical as well. They have lots of music in them, but it's not directly in the story. It's sort of like being heard in our minds. It's a kind of commentary on the story. That's the convention in American cinema. And it's being used increasingly in Indian cinema. And, that's fine. It's what directors want to do, and it's what audiences want, and it can be done creatively as well. But I personally do still like films in which the hero and heroines burst into song. Villains, by the way, almost never sing, right, in Hindi cinema. That's one of the conventions.
There's so many more questions, Philip Ji.
Bad people don't sing. Let's get some more questions.
Right, so many questions. One is from my colleague right here. Thank you, Professor, for your wonderful talk. Professor Amit Anurag in philosophy has asked this question. Thank you, Professor, for your wonderful talk. In your talk, you linked Indian cinematography with Indian darshan. Do you think it is a correlation, or darshan and cinematography share a causal relation? Do you think it is a correlation, or darshan and cinematography share a causal relation?
I would say it's more of a correlation. Well, no, both. I mean, I didn't go into today the sort of genealogy of Hindi cinema beyond mentioning photography. And if we look at some of the early, the Parsi Theater is very important in understanding the genealogy of the early cinema. And the Parsi Theater is an operatic theater that takes its storylines from both epics and Puranas, but also the Indo-Islamic Dastan tradition of epic storytelling, the Indo-Persian tradition, and Urdu. In all of these genres, there's a great deal of emphasis on eye contact and on the use of the eyes. And so I don't want to beat it over the head too much. I'm not trying to make an essentialization and say that, all Indian cinema is obsessed with the eyes or anything like that. But certainly in Western scholarship, the notion of the gaze, a very particular gendered notion of the gaze, which is often interpreted in psychoanalytic terms and assumes a largely male audience. That's a very important aspect of film theory in the West, but I think it's important in India to realize that there's a different notion of gaze and of what eye contact implies and does. So that's why I brought up darshan.
Okay, let's go to the next question. Philipji, this is from an anonymous attendee, so I don't know the name. Question is, thank you for the insightful session. Can you comment on the changing register from Urdu Hindustani to Hindi in film music? For example, Ye Muh Moh Ke Dhage or Havan Karenge demonstrate a Sanskritized Hindi register than the earlier Urdu Hindustani register. It's a question on language.
Yeah. Again, I don't know that I'm really qualified to talk about this because I don't know that I probably don't know nearly as many film songs as the person who's asking this question does. Certainly the linguistic register has been changing and is changing, and to some extent it represents, unfortunately, the communalization of language. The fact that Urdu is increasingly associated only with Muslims and Hindi only with Hindus, which was not the case in much of the 20th century. But I would say that the language of love still remains pretty heavily inflected by Urdu vocabulary of mohabbat and ishq. And, you know, and this is something that a number of scholars have written on. There's a very strong Urdu linguistic background to Hindi cinema. And I don't think that the purging of it, the sort of what you could call ethnic cleansing of language, which has happened really in Pakistan very strongly, cleansing the language of Sanskritic elements. Thank God, Bhagwan ki kripa se, it hasn't happened as much in India, even now. But I'm not denying that there may be a trend in that direction, and I suspect that the person who asked that question would have good evidence to support their position, and I just am not that knowledgeable.
All right, let's go to the next question by Sri Padma Holt. I loved listening to every word of Philip's presentation. Thanks for the talk, Philip, and thanks to Pankaj Jain. I'm wondering whether Philip has taken into account of non-Hindi movies into his analysis. Thank you.
Very little, because of my own linguistic limitations. I mean, I was a Hindi teacher, and Hindi is what I can manage with. So, I mean, I have seen other films. I have seen some Tamil films, and of course, Bengali films, Maharashtrian, Marathi films. But there's only one or two non-Hindi films on my website, because that's what I specialized in, and that's what I wanted to call attention to. And also, when I started writing about Hindi cinema, films in other languages were mainly not available on DVDs, or they were not available with good English subtitles, which I would need for those languages, and especially if I wanted to share them with students. So there just wasn't the same access, and that may be changing now. Tamil is getting more sophisticated. You can see more films, you can get them with good subtitles. But again, you know, it's hard to keep up with all this. I mean, there's thousands of films all the time, you know, and I do other things, you know, so.
We all try to do other things.
Thank you for a good question. And of course, I'm always careful to point out to students and audiences that the Hindi cinema is only one of many cinemas in India, and you know, strong cinemas with long traditions. Yeah.
Let's go to the next, so many questions. So let's go to the next one by Eileen Blaney. The question is, are there any films in particular that your students have responded most to? Which were the students' favorite films?
Yeah, well, when I taught this survey course, you know, it was a semester, so it was 15 weeks, and we would do a film a week. And we would have, in those days, public screenings that the students were expected to attend in the evening, but we also invited the general community to come in, and I think you may have come to some of them, Professor Jain. you know, I picked films that I thought people were going to like, and generally they did, and generally they responded very, very strongly and very positively. But I will tell you one interesting little anecdote. I taught a course at one point called India Through Film, which was intended to be a kind of an introductory civilization course. But again, it used films, and it used a film a week. And I started out with a big blockbuster Bollywood film. Actually, it was Farah Khan's first film. What was it with Shah Rukh?
Main Hoon Na, Main Hoon Na.
Main Hoon Na, yeah, it was Main Hoon Na, which I chose for various reasons. But the second film I went to was Pyasa by Gurdat. And that was a kind of culture shock for my students. And it was a culture shock, not just cinematically, but sort of technologically as well. A number of the students, we had a blog that the students had to write in each week. And some of the students wrote that it was the first black and white film they had ever seen. Now, these are, you know, 18, 19, 20-year-olds. I was shocked. I mean, that means that they had never seen some of the greatest Hollywood movies, you know, pre-color cinema. And so, you know, students wrote things like, you know, oh, I was kind of put off in the beginning by the fact that it was in black and white, but wow, they were really able to do some cool things with that. And, you know, and V.K. Murthy's legendary cinematography for that film really spoke to them. And it was interesting. There were 15, I think there were only about 13 students in the class. For the final assignment, which was a paper, 3 of them wrote on Pyasa. 3, you know, so a quarter of the class roughly chose Pyasa as the film they wanted to focus on. I mean, clearly it spoke to them very, very well. Incidentally, my colleague Corey Kriegmer has written about Pyasa, and he thinks it's one of the greatest films ever made anywhere. So.
Kya baat hai, kya baat hai, maza hai. Next question is from our colleague, my friend, my classmate, Michael Baltutis, who used to be my PhD friend in those days. Hello, Philip ji, so good to see you again. I enjoy your article on depictions of the Himalayas in Hindi film. What other regional conventions are common throughout Hindi film?
He is, thank you very much. He's referring to an article I wrote called Sex in the Snow,
I've read that also.
Which you can look up, which is about these love scenes that switch to the Himalayas. Like in the DDLJ, I didn't go far enough with Tujhe Dekha To Ye Jana Sanam, but it quickly switches to the Alps. And in fact, it ends with Shah Rukh and Kajol rolling down a hill in snow, you know, with her in a sari. So anyway, the convention of moving love songs into an extra social, what I call an extra social space, a space outside of the normal confines of society and societal expectations, is a very important device in a cinema that's very conscious of social categories, family values, a kind of a certain a strict notion of certain kinds of dharma. And you need to get the lovers out of that in order to fully express and explore their passion. So that's certainly one of the conventions, and the mountains have often been used for that. And I happen to love mountains myself. I'm speaking to you from basically a hill station in Colorado right now, which is, I'm fortunate enough to have a second home here. So I mean, that intrigued me, and it's something I wrote about. Other kind of regional,
I think we can mention about desert, right? The Rajasthani desert.
Well, the desert for certainly, yeah. A film that I like very much and that I've written about is Dil Se, Mani Ratnam's film from around 2001, I think.
Yes. Something.
I sometimes have started courses with that film because it's such a shock to students.
Yes.
You know, a musical about terrorism, right, and suicide bombing, right? You know, and it's in its own way, it's a hotcake film, although it was quite mainstream, and it has that wonderful soundtrack by A.R. Rahman.
Yes.
But one of the things that I find very interesting about that film, and if you look at my notes on it on the website, you'll see, is the way that the songs take us on a kind of tour of India, of the whole country, expressing different kind of moods and emotions through the very beautiful cinematography, but also critiquing, as the film does, the whole idea of the nation and the treatment of especially peripheral areas and minority populations, you know, building towards its very explosive and disturbing conclusion. So that would be another use of different kinds of regional tropes in film.
It's a great insight.
Of course, there are also, Hindi cinema abounds in unpleasant regional stereotypes, which I didn't go into, especially, you know, films of the 50s to 70s, the way they characterize Madrasis, right? South Indians, often, not always, but often, yeah.
All right, let's go to the next one by Sanil MN. Thank you, Professor Philip. If I may, for your interesting lecture, kindly share your understanding on economic transitions and culture in Indian popular cinema. Sanil M. Nilkandan. So understanding economic transitions.
I talked about that a little bit in bringing in Professor Gunty's notion of what happens to cinema after 1991, after the so-called liberalization of the Indian economy, and the rise of a increasingly powerful and increasingly large middle class, especially urban middle class. I'm not sure what else I can really say about that. I mean, budgets, of course, have gotten bigger and bigger and bigger for films. But on the other hand, the use of digital effects now has kind of leveled the playing field a bit in that, you know, directors can do all kinds of amazing things without having to actually build necessarily the giant sets and bring in thousands of extras. I mean, if you look at the battle scenes in Jodha Akbar, for example, you know, they're world-class CGI battlefield scenes that look quite amazing. Of course, it was a big budget film. So anyway, I don't really know quite what to say about that. I mean, the economics of the film industry, actually, Professor Gunty has written very eloquently and in great detail about this in another book that she did, which is about the ethnography of Bombay cinema and how films are made. And, you know, film financing has always been basically a nightmare in India. But one of the things that happened in the 1990s, and it happened, I must say, under the BJP, was the recognition of film as a legitimate industry. Because right from the Nehru era, there was a distrust of cinema and a treatment of cinema as being basically a vice, being in the vice sector of the economy, along with gambling and liquor and prostitution. And film directors had to go generally to black money in order to get funds to finance their films, and that changed in the 90s. So that cinema is now recognized as a legitimate industry. You often have banks being credited in the credits of films as providing finance, and that has made it maybe a little bit easier for directors to raise money to put films together, and that has encouraged more variety and experimentation.
All right, next question is from Kimberly Lutgendorf. Can you comment on the potential utility of Bollywood films in maintaining cultural or national identity among diasporic South Asians?
Well, I mean, many people have written about this, and there's certainly, it's a very good question, and it's a very important theme. I think the immediate example that leaps to mind is Hum Aapke Hain Kaun, which I featured in a slide in my PowerPoint from 1994, which is a film that has basically become a kind of script for how to do a wedding, how to do a Hindu wedding. And I recently heard about a couple that's getting married. The boy is Anglo-American and the girl is from Nagaland. Girl is from Nagaland. It's an international wedding with families from all over. But they're basically, but it's got, a Sangeet, and it's got lady Sangeet, and it's structured very much like the paradigmatic wedding that we're presented with in Hum Aapke Hain Kaun. And that has become a model for communities all over the world in, planning elaborate nuptials. So, but yeah, I mean, the films have been made. They've never, I don't think a film has ever been made that's aimed entirely at the diasporic audience. But the success of films in the diasporic community has certainly not been lost on filmmakers, and they do generate income there. Was it not Kal Ho Na Ho, Kabhi Khushi Kabhi Gum, Kabhi Khushi Kabhi Gum, opened in the United States basically at the same time that it opened in India, and it opened in large urban areas where there were large Indo-American communities, and there was usually one or two multiplex theaters that showed Hindi films. And the people in Hollywood got a shock because it opened as like the #3 or #4 film of that week in terms of the box office earnings. And the people that edited the weekly report on films were like, what the hell is this? They'd never, a film they'd never heard of, in a language they'd never heard of, by directors they'd never heard of, and it's grossing, it's in the top 10 grossing films in the United States. So that has happened a number of times, and it reflects the power of the diasporic community. Yeah.
Oh, there is a question by Professor Tejaswini Kanti, whom you referred to so extensively. Hi, Phil, Tejaswini here. Thank you for referencing my work. A quick comment about the Hindi-Urdu question. Contemporary lyricists and screenwriters are now paying attention to register and region, much more so the songs that were mentioned are referencing particular social linguistic milieus. There is still Urdu thing, Aadil Hai Mushkil or Bulaya, including Punjabi, and many of the songs from Rockstar and many more. So there is, like you said, Urdu is continuing. And that goes on.
I very much appreciate that. And Professor Ganti knows that I am a big fan of her work, as I think will have become clear from my talk today. And I really appreciate that input and, corrective, really. Yeah. And she's equipped to say that.
By Colin McEvoy, question, do you think the availability of Hindi Indian films and shows on streaming services like Netflix and Amazon Prime could lead to increased attention among American Western viewers in the same way that South Korean films like Parasite and shows like Squid Game have broken through to American viewers? Or do you believe Bollywood is too different from for American taste conventions for such breakthroughs to occur?
That's a great question. I certainly think that the availability of the films on Netflix is going to expose more people to them, because people are hunting around, they're looking for something different to watch. And people are likely to try, perhaps a Hindi film. That said, Hindi films do present some barriers to novice non-Indian background viewers. But it's been interesting to me right from the beginning of my work on Hindi cinema. I've gotten enthusiastic feedback from people, the most unlikely people in the most unlikely places. Somebody in, Kansas, an Anglo, a Gora Admi in Kansas, writes to me because he's been to my website, and he's an incredibly passionate viewer of Hindi films and very knowledgeable, and writes to me and says, why haven't you written about X, Y, and Z film? And there are pockets, here and there. And I mean, the presence of diaspora cinemas in major cities has already led to people bringing their non-Indian friends along to screenings, and people get exposed and they become sometimes very interested and very passionate. But there has never, at the same time as the questioner noted, there has never been a real crossover hit, as was the case, for example, with Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, the Chinese film. Even Lagan, which did get some viewing in big cinemas in the US, but it never really, I mean, it's a 4-hour movie about cricket, right? I mean, that's a little bit of a tough sell to an American audience, despite the fact that it's such an amazing film and so expertly paced and has such great music. But there's never been a real sort of super hit so far. It would be nice to see that, although I don't think that that's the criteria by which we should judge the success of Hindi cinema internationally. Hindi cinema has been mega successful in some other countries. And incidentally, I just want to mention here, Raj Kapoor was Chairman Mao's favorite actor. And Avara was basically required viewing. The 1951 amazing film, 1951 by Raj Kapoor, was basically required viewing by all Chinese citizens during the Cultural Revolution. And I found that my middle-aged Chinese language teaching colleagues at the University of Iowa could all sing the songs from Avara, even though they didn't know what they meant. They didn't know Hindi, but they had been exposed to them growing up during the Cultural Revolution. I mean, it was that widely screened.
And that's true probably also for the erstwhile USSR, where for the big hit, right? Russia. Right. Okay, next question is from Piyush Roy. Good morning, Dr. Lutgendorf. After an Indian way of filmmaking, is it time to explore about an Indian way of film thinking, especially in the context of audience expectation, essentialization of the Indian cinema, Bollywood experience, both inside and outside India? Critic, filmmaker, Professor Piyush Roy from RV University, Bangalore.
Well, that's an excellent question, and Professor Roy, I think you should write that essay or that book. There have been a number of studies that have come out that, if I can say so myself, they have been influenced by my essay. And there is a book that, unfortunately, I don't have the information about it right here, that just recently came out in India by, oh gosh, he's a South Indian critic, Raghavendra, which explores aesthetic categories in Indian cinema using some of the ideas that I put forth in that essay. And the author wrote to me and asked if he could dedicate the book to me, and I was kind of shocked. But I mean, no scholarship is ever the last word, and I certainly hope that other people will go forward and contradict me and correct me and bring me up to date, and bring in their own perspectives. And he raised a number of points that sound very interesting for further exploration.
All right.
Probably not by me.
Okay. A couple of more questions. I know we have taken a lot of your time, but thank you for patiently responding. I think people are just bursting.
Let's do another 5-10 minutes. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Next I'll take from a student from Dia Punappa. Hello, sir. I'm a theater student, and I'd like to know if you have any comments, resources on the aspects of Indian theater that have influenced Indian cinema.
Well, I mentioned a few. Thank you. That's a good question. And I mentioned, Nautanki, the folk theaters, Nautanki and Tamasha and Jatra in Bengal, Ram Leela, of course, we can point to in the Hindi hinterland. Again, I'm not qualified to talk about the current state of Indian theater, which again is open to all kinds of influences. And as I'm sure the student knows, starting in the 1980s, there was a strong movement in certain Indian theater circles to introduce more folk elements into the mainstream, urban proscenium arch theater, using more music and dance and more traditional kinds of aesthetics. Thinking of some of the work of Girish Karnad, who was a dear friend of mine and kind of mentor of me, but also Tendulkar in Marathi and other playwrights who really borrowed elements from folk theater to create a new kind of urban theater. So I don't really have much else to say about that, but it's a very good topic and a very good question. Theater has been influenced by cinema, right from the beginning of cinema, from cinema's popularity, and vice versa. So I expect that will continue as well.
That's a great one. I had missed out that even theater has been influenced by film. I was thinking of the Natya Sangeet, Maharashtrian Natya Sangeet influencing film, Parsi Theater influencing film, but the other way also has happened. So thank you.
I see a comment from Professor Gunty, which I think you should probably write.
Yes.
New York Times started to consistently review Hindi films from the early 2000s, right? And sometimes with very good reviews. I don't mean positive, but I mean very insightful, very analytical, critically sharp reviews done by people who knew what they were talking about and knew the cinema. So yeah, that's
I think that pretty much. I think we can conclude here. There are some tiny information or comments. There are more, but I think in the interest of time, probably we can stop here. Or if you would like me to read, I can read.
I see somebody has brought up, has raised the banner for Telugu cinema, and
yes,
I'm glad to see that again. It's a huge cinema.
Yes.
It's some years it's bigger. There are more releases in Telugu than in Hindi. Again, it's a lesser known cinema, unfortunately, that deserves to be much better known. And yes, of course, there's a big Telugu language community in the US and elsewhere in the Indian diaspora, and they do have Telugu films released almost simultaneously. Yeah.
I think then Professor Kim mentioned a long comment here on her article on Swaminarayan, I think. And then the New York Times question was raised by, I think, Professor Kim, that Professor Kenti responded already.
Okay.
That's it, I think. And everybody's thanking you profusely.
Okay. Well, I thank everybody for attending and for asking these very good questions. And it's been a pleasure. And it's morning here. I'm having my chai, but I think I'm going to move on to breakfast. So, and I'll let you maybe have dinner or whatever. And I do hope, I sincerely hope that everyone stays healthy, and that it becomes possible and comfortable for many of us to come back to India again. And I very much, Pune is one of my favorite places to go. And I very much hope to come again, and perhaps I can visit Flame next
Most welcome,
time.
of course, most
So,
welcome.
yeah, thank you all.
Everybody. Namaste.
And
Thank you.
namaskar. Good night.
Good night.